Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics. I'm Emma Larouche from the University of Canberra's Media and Comms team, and in the studio is Michelle Grattan to talk about what's been another busy week for the Albanese government. Hi Michelle.
Hello Emma.
So we'll start with looking at Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, visiting Indonesia, but then on the home front, the attention of the public and the government has been firmly focused on the rising cost of living, the energy crisis and Tuesday's rise in the cash rate by the Reserve Bank. Now let's start with that. The Reserve Bank has increased rates for the second month in a row, raising the cash rate by 50 basis points to 0.85%. The bank says there are more rises to come. So why did the RBA raise the rate by this much? And which it was at the higher end of expectations. Will people with mortgages be able to cope with this?
I think the bank wanted to have an announcement effect, in other words, to say that it was serious about pushing up rates, and of course it's given notice that this won't be the last increase. We can expect others between now and the end of the year. But if it goes hard this time, then it is hoping that this will have an effect on cooling things down, and perhaps the other rises won't need to be as large or as fast. As for whether people will cope, well, quite a lot of people built up a buffer in the COVID period, and they weren't then spending so much money and so had a chance to accumulate some cash. And also, of course, some people paid their mortgages off faster in that time. But for a lot of people who borrowed large amounts when house prices were really high, I think that the rise will in fact stretch them to the limit, and certainly the future rises will do so. And remember that the bank a while ago was saying that there wouldn't be any rises, it didn't think, until 2024. So in a way, because it made a wrong calculation, people were lulled into a false sense of security that they could service bigger loans than in fact they can.
So do you think mortgage holders are feeling like they've been misled by the RBA?
Obviously they weren't deliberately misled, but in fact, yes, I think that there is a good deal of criticism around the place of the RBA for getting its forecasts, its assessments wrong. And of course, the government is intending to set up an inquiry into the RBA.
Now let's move on to Australia's energy crisis. It continues and it's expected to worsen over the coming months, with the cost of energy still rising and hitting households and businesses. Now, Chris Bowen, the new energy minister, held a meeting with federal and state energy ministers to discuss the gas crisis. These ministers agreed to some measures, including the preparation of a transition plan to cleaner energy. But will their initiatives do anything much in the short term?
No, they won't, and also I think more initiatives will be needed. Chris Bowen's made it clear that all options are on the table. I think that the government is looking at the so-called trigger mechanism, which allows governments to tell gas companies that they need to divert some production to the domestic market. But this is at the moment a pretty blunt instrument, because even if it was pulled now, it wouldn't come into effect until January. So I think that there will be possibly some changes to that. The gas companies, of course, are not keen on that mechanism at all, but certainly the government and the state governments will need to hone their response over the coming months so that the energy crisis doesn't get worse, and that future crises can be, to the extent possible, averted.
And now we're hearing from the federal opposition who are starting to talk nuclear. Why are they starting to advocate for nuclear power now when they didn't say much about it when they were in government?
Well, absolutely. And I think there are a couple of reasons that the former government didn't think that nuclear would have public support, and so it was not discussed. But nevertheless, a number of coalition members have been long-time supporters of nuclear, and so freed from the restraints of government, they're now going public and advocating it strongly. And secondly, I think that the opposition is looking for things to talk about. It really is struggling a bit in these early days out of power, and nuclear is a catchy topic and one that has a constituency out there. But I think it's unwise for the opposition to go too far down this path, because it really has to have a big examination of its energy policy rather than rushing into putting thoughts out there which it may not later want to carry through. So I think this discussion of nuclear is very premature on the opposition's part. Chris Bowen also makes the point that nuclear in economic terms is not very efficient. It doesn't stack up on that front. So leaving aside all the other problems with it, it would be perhaps a rash path for the opposition to go down to be advocating at the next election.
And I guess this is an issue where governments sort of have to tread carefully and be quite considered, as you mentioned. But at the same time, there's sort of, you feel like there's that urgency with the prices skyrocketing to sort of allay concerns from consumers.
Well, that's right. On the government side, it is really trying to say, well, there's only a limited amount we can do, certainly in the short term. It's blaming the previous government for leaving an energy policy scene that was totally inadequate. Now, that blame is fair enough, because the government, of course, over a decade was consumed with infighting over energy policy and did not set out a credible transition plan. But from Labor's point of view, blaming a former government really has only a fairly short shelf life. People say, okay, month, 2 months, 3 months, but they soon forget what went before and they turn their blame on the current government.
And another challenge, just the cost of living in general, is a major issue in Australia right now, with prices skyrocketing. On everyday items, we've seen iceberg lettuce reaching $11 in some areas. That's just ridiculous. What can we talk about in this space?
I see one of the fast food chains has turned to cabbage. But I think that people are going to be feeling the pinch on many fronts in coming months, because the March budget measures will be over. The petrol excise cut, for example, is due to run out, and this government has said that it can't see itself renewing that. We're going to get higher levels of inflation, and already it's more than 5%. So it is going to be a tough few months, and the government is really going to be under increasing pressure, and I think that the budget in October is going to be really hard for it to frame. It's talking about relief in terms of its childcare policy and lower medicine costs, which it promised in the campaign, but it doesn't seem to be inclined to put out more cash, and that would be very inflationary if it did. If it did decide to go down that road, it would have to be very tightly targeted.
So since taking on government, Treasurer Jim Chalmers hasn't indicated any other forms of cost of living relief as he prepares for this October budget?
No, it's been very limited what he's holding out, and he's talking about real wages increasing, but again, that depends on a whole lot of things, some of them, most of them indeed, out of the government's control. So I think at the moment the government is really searching around for what it can do without putting pressure on the budget, and that's a very difficult situation to be in.
Yes, it's certainly going to be a very difficult time for the Treasurer as he prepares the budget for October, but a bit of a bright spot, circling back to the beginning of the week when the Prime Minister was in Indonesia strengthening ties there.
Yes, it was another good trip. Anthony Albanese's had 2 trips since being Prime Minister in quick succession, and the visit to Indonesia went off very well, and I think that it did lay the basis for closer ties in trade, investment, other areas. But nevertheless, getting those ties actually into place is another thing, of course, and doing business in Indonesia for Australian businesses is not always all that easy. There was a business delegation that went with the Prime Minister, so let's hope the way is smooth for an even stronger relationship, because it's such an important country. But on the other hand, I think with the cost of living crisis affecting so many people at home, Anthony Albanese will have to be talking domestic problems and policies in the coming weeks and focusing his attention on the local scene.
It'll be interesting to see what he has to say. And thank you, as always, Michelle, for your insight into the week in politics.
Thanks, Emma.